Hello, welcome to Stars, Cells, and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science that have theological and philosophical implications, as well as new discoveries that point to the reality of God's existence. My name's Jeff Zweerink, and today we're going to look at a discussion or a controversy surrounding Hubble and the law named after him. But before we get into the discussion, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, Reasons to Believe, so you can be notified of new weekly videos. You can learn more at reasons.org or by following us on our social media at RTB Official. David, it is great to have you here today. I know, kind of give us a little bit of just your professional story, if you will. Why are you here and why are we talking to you today?
So I used to serve as director of the Anglo-American Cosmic Dust Laboratory in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I've been involved in astronomy research, not only research into astronomical observations, but also research into the history of astronomy for many decades now. And I believe, Jeff, that I first met you in the 1980s. Reasons to Believe was just in its very inception phase. I don't even know if there were 5 members, in fact. But to fast track to 2022, I am proudly an RTB scholar, a visiting scholar for a couple of weeks. After this, heading to Hawaii to speak there. And so as a visiting research scholar, it's just such a joy to be here. And that's the reason why David and my beloved wife, Liz, are in Los Angeles.
Well, I know I've really enjoyed our time to discuss and the interactions we've had, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yes.
Because this is one of those examples where there's a name or something gets associated and it becomes the common lore, if you will, of the field.
Correct.
And it turns out to just be incorrect, but it's really hard to change. And so this relates to the expansion of the universe and who discovered it and how it played out. So why don't you give us some background on what we're going to be talking about, and we'll get around to why it's important in a bit.
I suppose that many of my students might say to me, Professor, who was or who is the father of Big Bang cosmology? And everybody, I mean, if you look at any astronomy textbook, anyone, I mean, of the multiplied hundreds or thousands one can think of, Edwin Hubble, paper of 1929 is believed to be the definitive paper marking the discovery of the Big Bang, of Big Bang cosmology. His famous plot in 1929 of velocity versus distance. That's velocity at which galaxies recede from us versus their distance. It's a linear plot in Hubble 1929. If you double the distance to a galaxy, you double the speed at which it's going away from us. And the idea is essentially that if you run the movie backwards in time in this expanding universe, eventually you come to the creation point, if you like, which is the Big Bang. But Hubble, everywhere you look, certainly until I had done my research and others had done their historical detective work, was regarded as the father of the Big Bang, and of course appeared, Jeff, on Time magazine cover as the father of Big Bang cosmology.
Well, I mean, I know I have used that. One of the plots I often use, you're talking about Big Bang cosmology. You talk about, general relativity, and I attribute that to Einstein. You talk about whether there's a beginning, and, there's various people, and that's a little more complicated. But when I talk about the expansion of the universe, it's like I put up, here's Hubble's diagram. Here's the discovery of the expansion of the universe.
Exactly.
This isn't the right way. Well, it's not the whole story. It's certainly not the right way to look at it. So I know you've done a lot of work to see what did Hubble do and what did he maybe take from other people. So kind of give us, what have you found as you've done your historical work?
Let's just backtrack a little bit. I did my doctorate in galaxy morphology, Jeff, which is the shapes and sizes and dynamics of galaxies. And again, in every textbook, you find the Hubble classification scheme of galaxies. It's like a Y tilted on its side, and you've got the elliptical galaxies on the left side of the prongs, And then you've got the spirals on the other side of forming the two prongs in your Y.
Right.
And I then looked at Hubble's original paper, that would be Hubble 1926, to see, well, there obviously must be a tuning fork diagram there, and if there is, it's obviously got to be called after the author.
Right.
But to my great surprise, I found that there was no Hubble tuning fork there. There was no diagram. There was no diagram at all. And to fast track, I flew to Pasadena. I met with Alan Sandage, who was Hubble's right-hand man, who served as one of the greatest astronomers of all time, really, Alan Sandage. And he was astonished, and he walked me down to the Astrophysical Journal area of 1926.
Okay.
And he opened the volume, and as he opened the volume, he indeed concurred with me that there's no diagram there. But also, penciled in Hubble's handwriting was the nomenclature, if you like, used by J.H. Reynolds to classify galaxies. So we think Hubble was the first one to actually go and systematically classify normal and barred spiral galaxies. But no, Sandage showed me very clearly that in Hubble's writing was the references to the work of Reynolds. And so this set me on a whole detective trail: is what is Hubble's, what is not Hubble's? Which data did Hubble use, and which data did Hubble not use? Was Hubble a meticulous annotator and referencer of previous and existing works in astronomy, or was everything just bundled under the name of Edwin Hubble? I mean, you have everything, you know. You have Hubble's tuning fork. You have Hubble's luminosity profile. You have Hubble's law. And there are about 10 are named after Hubble. But the point in my detective work was this, Jeff: how much of this is true and how much of this is actually gently taken from other people's work and ideas. And we must remember this, Jeff. When we are talking about Big Bang cosmology and the father of it, we're talking of one of the greatest discoveries of all time. So many viewers might say, well, David, you know, what's in a name? If it's not Hubble, it's somebody else. But when it comes to like the unlocking of the DNA, or the father of Big Bang cosmology, you have to get your historical records in line, because credit has to be given, Jeff, where credit is due.
Well, that's one of the, just even as I've been doing research and written papers, that's a key part of writing a good paper. It's not just, okay, I can reference this paper, but it was like, there may be a summary, but when you want to get to the idea, you got to get to the original idea.
Absolutely.
And so I want to go back to your discussion about, so you're looking at the astrophysical journals where you've got the annotation in Hubble's handwriting. So if I got what you were saying there, it's like in his writing, he's using somebody else's classification, but seems to be passing it off as his own.
Well, that's correct. In fact, it's a double mystery, because not only does he take the galaxy classification scheme really drawn up by one of the great British astronomers, J.H. Reynolds, very interesting character. And you can read a lot more about J.H. Reynolds in a book I wrote with Ken Freeman called Shrouds of the Night, published by Springer in New York. But yes, in that paper of 1926, in Hubble's own handwriting, is a reference to another masterpiece, which is a masterpiece by John Reynolds on the classification of galaxies. But then the point really is that where does the Hubble tuning fork come from? And it turns out that Sir James Jeans, the great British astronomer, adored music and wrote a book which I think was called Science and Music, something along those lines, Science and Music. And in there, Sir James Jeans presents the now traditional Y diagram. And Hubble sees this. It's amazing. Hubble sees this diagram and says, well, this is amazing. This just works for me perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes and uses that in the realm of the nebulae, which is the famous popular book that Hubble published. But it's astonishing, right, that the actual galaxy classification scheme is misattributed to Hubble, and the tuning fork should be the Sir James Jeans tuning fork.
Gotcha.
And I have that book. Science and Music, or Cosmogony and Music, something like that, by Jeans, and there's the tuning fork. So this was a pattern which is going to repeat itself, Jeff, over and over again throughout Hubble's life. Is papers would be written containing ideas or data points from others and not referenced.
So I have a question in that, because I've written on the multiverse, and I can't say the multiverse is an idea to me, but really the genesis is like, okay, people are talking about this. I need to understand it, so I go out and read. Yes. And there is a cosmologist, he's been at Harvard, MIT, Max Tegmark, and he came up with what I just thought was a beautiful scheme talking about the multiverse. There's the level 1, the level 2, level 3, level 4. And so, I use that terminology all the time.
Right.
In my writings, the vast majority of time, anytime I reference it, I go back and I give him credit for it, because I get it. I think it's a beautiful mnemonic or way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. Is there a problem here with Hubble using other people's stuff, or is it something else?
Well, this is a very profound question, and I think it's something else, because there are just too many missing pieces in this detective puzzle. It's one thing to let this happen once and say, well, astronomers were talking of the Hubble, of classifying galaxies, and Hubble synthesizes that. Mm-hmm. But when there's no diagram there at all, that immediately alerts you that something is really gravely amiss. Now, if you look, for example, at Hubble's graph in the seminal 1929 paper, there are lots of data points. I think Hugh Ross said 80 or 90% of the data points come from Vesto Slipher. And he is also not referenced. He's also not referenced in Hubble 29.
So Slipher's not even in the paper?
That's what as I recall, is that it just gives you data points as if they are secured from Edwin Hubble.
Oh, interesting.
And so most of those come from Slipher, and a few of them, as I recall, come from Humason, who worked with Hubble at the time. But the point was that I then became very suspicious of Edwin Hubble, not in terms of being an astronomer. He is still regarded as one of the really great astronomers of the current epoch. But as a Christian, let me say this, Jeff, credit must be given where credit is due.
Right.
And I think that if people are slaving away, for example, at telescopes and securing data points, I have to reference them. I have to acknowledge my sources. And to go back to your original question, it seems like Hubble's persona was immense, or to use a better word, even astronomical. Hubble was regarded in his day as the king, the emperor, let's use that word, as the emperor of the galaxies. And I've subsequently developed a talk based on what we'll chat about later on today, called The Naked Emperor, based on the famous book, The Emperor Has No Clothes. And it's terribly unfortunate that Hubble allowed this persona to osmose through multitudes of papers, textbooks, and so on, as if it's his. And to the best of my knowledge, well, certainly to the best of Alan Sandage's knowledge too, this was never, ever properly referenced. It upset Alan Sandage so much that I remember being on the phone to him in Pasadena. I was in Johannesburg shortly before Alan Sandage died, which is a couple of years ago now. And he just said, David, I do not know where to turn anymore, given what you've uncovered. I'm appalled. I don't know what word he exactly used, but he couldn't believe that this was a recurring theme in the persona of Edwin Hubble.
I remember when we were discussing this a few days ago earlier in your visit, and as I was hearing it, there was part of me that it's not surprising. I mean, scientists, we have this idea I've had in my mind of scientists are these objective, rational, logical, ethical people, and they're people just like the rest of us. I mean, there's nothing different about that. So the fact that somebody would do this is not surprising, but it does raise some difficulties in wrestling with how do we take it seems to hit at the credibility of science.
Correct.
Because
absolutely,
and again, I don't think there's anything wrong, or what Hubble has shown, or what's attributed to Hubble is scientifically accurate, but yet his personality got in the way of doing the attributions and the credit well, and so people aren't getting credit for the work they did.
Well, Jeff, the point really is they weren't all correct, because if you look carefully at the astronomical journals, there was a very obscure journal published in Belgium, very obscure, not read by the masses. Pasadena was the center of the universe in Edwin Hubble's time. Mount Palomar, Mount Wilson, of course.
Right.
And so I discovered, and there were others who discovered this as well, we have to give credit where credit's due, but I was one of those who noted that 2 years prior to Hubble's paper of 1929 was a paper by a Catholic priest. Now, this is terribly interesting because he was one of the really most brilliant experts on general relativity and on cosmology. This is Georges Lemaître, who was a Belgian priest, a Catholic priest, and an ardent or devout, I would think, man of God who studied the universe. Now, if you look at the field equations, which of course I was very familiar with when I did the detective story, I saw that Lemaître had actually solved Big Bang cosmology, not in 1929, but in 1927. But not only that, not only had he discovered Hubble's law now,
right.
That's the point. Not only had he discovered that galaxies should recede as velocities proportional to distance, not only had he discovered that, Lemaître, but he actually gave a calculation based on the data he had accessible at the time on the Hubble constant. And,
okay.
And of course, it's not the Hubble constant, it's the Lemaître constant, because he computed this 2 years earlier. So he goes to prove mathematically that if we live in an expanding universe, which is, say, isotropic and homogeneous, and you look at the metrics therein, then the universe should be expanding according to this law. Velocity is proportional to distance, and that the rate should be whatever figure it was, kilometers per second per megaparsec. And so I saw that that's the Rosetta Stone. We're not talking here of just a name, Jeff. That's the Rosetta Stone. I think that's why I come over so strongly and so passionately when I talk about that, is that paper in Lemaître, 1927, is the veritable Rosetta Stone for all Big Bang cosmology.
Right.
And, to my mind, the first telescope in space should be the Lemaître Space Telescope. Not because I've got any guns to grind against Edwin Hubble, but that's the Rosetta Stone.
Right.
But because it was published in an obscure journal in Belgium and not available to the masses, Hubble publishes his paper in 1929 with no reference at all to Lemaître. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think he ever actually in his papers cited Lemaître, to the best of my knowledge. But anyway, why I became so disgruntled by all of this is not just a mere name now. This is the Rosetta Stone, which I know is the Rosetta Stone here at Reasons to Believe, right?
Right.
Is you are all adherents to Big Bang cosmology. And it's very interesting that the Big Bang, which is regarded so much as by certain Christians as one of the greatest enemies of our faith is in fact developed by a devout believer in God. From everything I've read, Lemaître was a devout believer. He even has annotated. I visited the Lemaître archives in Belgium, my son Aaron and myself, and we actually have in Lemaître's writing Pascal, certain of the Pensées, numbered and so forth. So he was a very devout man of God, from what I can understand. But as I say, to have the Rosetta Stone eclipsed was a sin, if you like, that I could not let go.
You know, that's a startling discovery. I mean, for numbers of reasons. One is you've got this, how we think about cosmology today is really attributed to the wrong person.
Exactly, absolutely.
And, I don't know whether that was Hubble knew about the paper and didn't say, there's a whole lot of unknown there about this. But this idea... So there's this idea that Hubble came up with it.
Yes.
We have the research now that shows otherwise.
Yes, absolutely.
But, I mean, I do quite a bit of work on this, and this is the first I'm really hearing of it.
Yes.
In the context of, I've heard that Lemaître was involved, but not, but it's like, it's
Rosetta Stone.
That we really just think about it wrongly. And
I know.
So my question to this, it seems like it's hard to dislodge these very popular notions because one other popular notion is that science and the Christian faith are antagonistic to one another.
Exactly.
And if I could just read, I just wanted to read a quote out of a book called Science and Religion, A Historical Introduction by Gary Ferngren, where they're talking about this conflict thesis. And, you talk to many scientists, many people as they're writing about it, it's, science and religion are in conflict. And this is the statement by historians of science.
Yes.
However, it is a salutatory to note that serious historical scholarship has revealed the conflict thesis is, at best, an oversimplification and at worst, a deception. So here's this very popular notion that science and religion are in conflict with one another. But yet you've got the historians of science for at least 20, maybe 30 years saying that's not the right way to look at it. But yet that's still the public perception.
Well, in South Africa, and I believe here, I was just chatting to Hugh Rice in the car coming back from San Diego. He was just saying this very point is that, I get told over and over again, Professor, you cannot believe in the Big Bang because Big Bang equals evolution equals no God. That's the equation I get all the time. I get thrown at in South Africa and I get thrown at here. Big Bang equals evolution equals no God.
Right.
And yet here I sit as an Orthodox Jew who came to faith in Yeshua Jesus in 1976. And I see the most glorious harmony. The Big Bang's not my enemy, it's my greatest friend. I see the most glorious harmony between the books of nature and the book of Scripture. And in fact, there's a book I wrote, as you know, with Professor Ken Freeman, one of the greatest pioneers on dark matter. And Ken and I wrote this book published in Chicago by Crossway called God and Galileo. And there we see, and there we argue, and we see that the harmony which between the two books goes back, way back to Galileo and even prior to that. But Galileo's life was on the line, Jeff, because he was saying there's a glorious harmony between the two books, the book of nature and the book of Scripture, if you interpret the book of Scripture correctly. But if you interpret it incorrectly, for example, it states in the Scriptures, the earth cannot be moved, the earth is on its foundations and is fixed and cannot be moved. If you take that literally, you're stuck with a geocentric universe, which means everything goes around the earth and the earth is stationary and forever fixed on its foundations. But, I mean, you come into an immediate problem there because Jesus says in John 10, I believe, he says, I am the door. And nobody would argue that if you come into a door or knock on a door, that you're encountering the presence of our beloved Savior, Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
You've got to determine. So Galileo understood this all very clearly and tried to argue for faith in God as a creative astronomer, as a creative scientist. And he's very fortunate, I think largely due to his connections with the Duchess of Tuscany and so on, the Medici family, that he wasn't actually, burnt at the stake for heresy. Because remember, he had to recant his ideas in Rome. In the famous trial, he had to recant all his ideas. It's a shocking revelation of people who regard themselves as fundamentalists and who are interpreting the Bible without taking credence of the book of nature and coming to diverse or divorce conclusions as you've read out. And so in the context of this interview, one of my greatest scientific friends is undoubtedly the Big Bang.
Right.
Because I see such harmony there. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. So there is a beginning. If the Bible is to be the inspired word of God, Jeff, there has to be a beginning in cosmic space and in cosmic time. And then when I look at my equations in general relativity and the papers and the solutions of Lemaître in 1927, I see that, there's a beginning. There has to be a beginning. And we live in an expanding universe, expanding as a result of this beginning. And that's why I'm so excited to be a creative scientist who's also a believer.
Right. Well, and that's one of the things I wonder. I mean, you look at this kind of the conflict thesis started in the early 1900s.
Yes.
Had it been well known that here you've got this Belgian Catholic priest,
yes, absolutely,
who's devout man of God,
absolutely,
but yet he comes up with this.
Absolutely.
That just kind of gets rid of that. You can't have this conflict there.
No,
There's got to be something else going on. So had Lemaître had his credit,
yes,
it may have subverted this or undermined this idea that science and faith are in conflict with one another.
Absolutely. I think that if Lemaître was credited already in 1927 or 1928, there might have been a great step forward with regard to the harmony of faith and science. But people today regard the Big Bang as something wielded upon by atheistic cosmologists and so forth. And the father of the Big Bang is Georges Lemaître. There is zero doubt about that. And yes, a devout man of God who loved the Bible, as far as I understand it. He loved the Bible. He was a priest also, and who loved the mathematics of the expanding universe, and went to lay the Rosetta Stone in his paper.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I find that fascinating, all of that, especially in the context of when Lemaître proposed the Big Bang.
Yes.
It's not like scientists said, we got the Big Bang, we attacked Christianity. In some sense, you can make an argument that throughout the 20th century, cosmologists were brought to Big Bang cosmology kicking and dragging and screaming because they wanted the universe to be eternal. Exactly. And you've got this model which has a beginning.
Exactly.
So I find that actually very potent evidence in favor of the Big Bang. It's like this is what they didn't want to be the case.
They didn't want it. Astronomers did not want the universe to have a beginning in space and time. I think that's beautifully summed up, Jeff, in a book by Robert Jastrow called God and the Astronomers, who speaks about the expanding universe. And he says, as astronomers scale the final mountains, the final rocks, they meet the Creator, or they meet a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. And so, yes, I mean, the Big Bang, now as I have done my historical detective work and so forth, the Big Bang is one of Christianity's greatest friends, discovered, pioneered by a Christian himself, Georges Lemaître. And this is terribly important because it's not only what's in a name, is it Hubble's law, but it's going to do to something far deeper, which you so beautifully point out in that book, Science and Religion, is that we're dealing with the heart of something which is so critical, and that is an apparent divorce between faith and science.
Right.
Faith in God and science. And the Big Bang, correctly understood, Jeff, is in the most glorious harmony with Genesis chapter 1. And its foundations, the Rosetta Stone, is not by some, person who wants to disprove the Bible and so on and so on and so on. Georges Lemaître simply wanted the truth to be exposed, and in the most beautiful, in his own humble way, presents the solution to the equations and an estimated value of the Lemaître constant.
It is fascinating. One last question I have for you before we wrap up. In the theme of we've got these ideas where Hubble came up with the Big Bang, you've got science and faith and science and religion in conflict with one another.
Yes.
There's another idea out there that is, again, pervasive amongst most of my scientific colleagues or people who address this, is that, Copernicus, when he came along, that he dethroned the Earth from its great and glorious foundation and put it out as this run-of-the-mill start out there.
That's right.
And again, the research shows that is very cliched, that the Earth was at the dregs of the universe by being in the center, and it's now elevated out into to the harmony of the stars, if you will.
Exactly.
But yet this idea persists. Any thoughts on how do we address these long-standing, pervasive ideas that just turn out to be wrong?
Yes. It's very difficult, especially when you've got, for example, the Hubble Space Telescope. So as I'm talking to you, papers are being written using observations from the Hubble Space Telescope. And, my greatest plea for those watching is, where's the Lemaître Space Telescope? And I think it's almost impossible to change. But I do want to make one comment, if I may, as we wrap up, and that is, I threw all my toys out the cot with regard to what I had discovered, and bands of other historians had also done this. We were all very agitated. And in fact, I like to think that I was one of the prime movers of getting this before the IAU, that's the International Astronomical Union. And they got all astronomers to vote whether it should remain Hubble's law a couple of years ago, just a few years ago. Unfortunately, I was not asked to present the detective work, which I think would have been ethically correct, but that's another story. But the point is it was presented. And so the majority of astronomers, I think about 80% of astronomers, agreed to have it renamed as the Hubble-Lemaître law. So to me, it's not satisfactory at all. Now suddenly it's, instead of the Hubble law, it's another name just tagged on the end. The human frame, the human neurophysiological process remembers the name Hubble, and Lemaître is just tagging on as a sideshow. Whereas it should be, in my mind, the Lemaître law. I can honestly say that here's a paper with a law, with the Hubble's, the rate of expansion of the universe, Lemaître's law. To change these fundamental concepts, Jeff, in science is well nigh impossible once the osmosis has taken place. It's very, very, very hard to turn around. I tried my level best to get the law named the Lemaître law. People still felt that we can't dislodge Hubble. He was the king of the galaxies, which in many areas he was with regard to his observations of Cepheids and much besides. But when it comes to what we're talking about here, the father of Big Bang cosmology, it's just too difficult. And I think the reason it's just too difficult is everything's Hubble now. There's, as I said, the Hubble Space Telescope. There's the Hubble luminosity profile. And every time I present my case, people say, but David, you're having a dig at Hubble. The man's dead. And yes, the man is dead, but that's the wonder of history, right? And as Christians, and this is another point, as Christians, you and I must be seekers after the truth. And part of the seekers of truth is to see who presents which ideas first. And when it comes to something, not just a little law, but a Rosetta Stone solved mathematically and then computationally or astronomically in terms of kilometers per second per megaparsec or whatever units Lemaître used at that stage, I believe that it sort of sets my heart at ease. Why? Because the Big Bang is bathed under the mantle of a Catholic priest, a very humble Catholic priest. And I think that if future books or people watching this program rewrite books on the history of the expanding universe by featuring Georges Lemaître, I've written many, many papers on this. You just Google David Bloch, Georges Lemaître. My name even appears in the final AAU resolution when the name was changed. But it's not enough, you know. I don't think Hubble to Hubble-Lemaître is going to do one iota of good to Lemaître himself. Do you agree, Jeff?
I do, and I tell you, you've convinced me. Like I said, I've done lots of talks where I talk about how Hubble measured this.
Exactly.
I'm now going to go change those to make sure that Lemaître gets his due, because I think that's important that he knows, and I think it has important apologetic value. So I really appreciate a discussion. Thanks for what you brought, and I hope you have enjoyed this, and thank you for joining us today. Join us in the discussion below. Love to hear your comments. Remember to like this video, subscribe for more comments, set a reminder so you get new episodes as they come out on each Thursday, available here on YouTube, your favorite podcast app. Share it with a friend, and just remember, the more we learn about science, the more we have reasons to believe.